Welcome, I'm Erin Harper, and this is Preserving Your Food, Canning, Freezing, and Drying. This is part of Vermilion County Master Gardeners have a continuing education. So one Tuesday evening a month, they have some sort of a presentation on a various topic having to do with gardening, in this case, food preservation. So those are ongoing. So if you're interested or you live in this area, you can keep an eye out for those moving forward. So one Tuesday every month, they have some sort of a program. So today we're talking about preserving your food. And we had such an overwhelming response to this presentation that we have invited Mary Liz Wright to join us. So Mary Liz holds a master's degree in family and consumer science from Eastern Illinois and a bachelor's in theology from Loyola University in Chicago. She has been with Extension for 17 years, and she serves in Cook, Crawford, and Edgar counties. And her expertise is general nutrition, food safety, and food preservation and cottage foods. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mary Liz. She's going to take over the presentation, and hopefully you all learn a lot from this. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Erin. I appreciate that intro. Everyone, welcome. We're glad that you're here. I am absolutely thrilled that you're all interested in learning how to preserve your food. Why do we want to preserve food? Well, you might want to save what you've grown or purchased. Maybe you want to prepare the food the way you like. You want to know what's in your food. Perhaps you have some dietary concerns, or you'd like to save or even make some money by selling some of your preserved foods at the farmer's market. And then again, boy, it just makes you feel good to see those jars of food lined up on your shelves and ready for you to use them all winter long. So today, we're going to be giving you a very, very basic overview of food preservation. If you'd like to learn more, and certainly in more specifics, you can join us for the Nutrition and Wellness Food Preservation webinar series that will be coming to you on Wednesdays in June and July. We'll talk more about that later. You can always go to our website, which is illinois.edu/food preservation. We have a very comprehensive web page. You should be able to watch the videos, read the directions, find recipes. Most people find it to be very useful. So primarily this program is about keeping yourself and your family safe. There's a small risk of illness involved anytime you handle food. But we hope that you will learn how to reduce that risk today. So what is food preservation? Well, food preservation is making the environment where we keep the food hostile to pathogens. And we can do this by a few ways: eliminating most of the moisture, exposing the product to high heat, adding acid to the product, or eliminating oxygen. And the basic methods by which we do this is by canning. And the definition of canning is foods placed in jars, heated to a temperature that destroys microorganisms and inactivates enzymes. Freezing reduces the temperature so that the microorganisms cannot grow and enzyme activity is slowed. And drying removes most moisture from foods so that microorganisms cannot grow. All right, and we're going to go into those in some detail as we move through this program. But first, Erin, we'd like you to share a little bit of your expertise about how well-preserved food begins in the garden.
So you always want to make sure that the foods that you're using are ripe or underripe. You don't want overripe food because then it has already started to break down. So we want to make sure that we are using our highest quality foods when we can or preserve. If it's already started to grow some mold on it, that's definitely something you don't want to be preserving because there's so many things in there that you're fighting against already. So we want really nice, high quality foods. And again, harvest at peak, sort of peak ripeness. And then you don't want it to sit off of the plant for very long after you've harvested it, because it will begin, as soon as you pull it off of that plant, it starts to break down because it's not connected to that living thing anymore. So you want to preserve your food as soon as possible after harvesting it. So food preservation is not a way necessarily to preserve foods that are sort of starting to go bad. If your tomatoes have been sitting there for a week and they start to shrivel up or to not look very good, that's not the point to decide to preserve them. You want to preserve those as soon as you take them off of the plant. And then there are some different types of produce that you can use for canning or preserving that are going to serve you better. So in the photo on the left, that is a paste tomato, P-A-S-T-E, so sort of tomato paste. So those are types of tomatoes that have more of the flesh in them and less of the juicy and seed part on the inside. So slicing tomatoes are the big round juicy ones that you just want to eat. You don't necessarily want to can those because you're usually going to turn this into a sauce or something, and through the process of making the sauce, part of that is removing some of the moisture. So if you use these paste tomatoes, you're sort of already halfway there. So that'll cut down on your cooking time. And they're just a really solid, more solid tomato. And the plants will produce a lot really quickly. So that's also good for preserving. So you can kind of do a big batch all at once. So there are other varieties of fruits that are good for storage or for canning. You can oftentimes find that on the seed catalog, in the seed catalog or on the websites that you're purchasing seeds from. Sometimes they will say that they're better for canning. So another one that I want to point out is cucumbers. So there are some cucumbers that are good for pickling and some that aren't. So you want one that has a thinner skin. If you're going to pickle a cucumber whole, so those big large pickles that you can get at like sporting events and stuff that are pickled whole, you have to have a thinner skin there so that the brine can actually move in and out of that a lot easier. So those cucumbers are the ones at the store. They're called salad cucumbers. You just want to make sure that you have the ones that have the thinner skin. Some of the classic ones that we use have a much thicker waxy skin, and just the brine won't be good for that, and that will get really tough, especially if it's heated. It'll kind of get tough the longer it sits. So if you're going to be growing stuff for preservation, you just want to think about the types that you're purchasing.
All right, thank you, Erin. Excellent. So we're going to process. The main thing is to keep things safe. And what I usually say is, you know, food preservation is science, but it's not rocket science. If you keep things clean and you follow the directions, you will have a very satisfactory product. So we're worried about foodborne illness. Most foodborne illness happens because of poor personal hygiene or poor safety practices in the kitchen. We always begin everything by washing our hands. You might think this is funny, but we even suggest you wash your hands before you go to the garden to harvest the vegetables or fruits. And the reason being, whatever germs are on your hands are then transferred to the surface of your produce. So wash your hands before and after the garden. We also suggest that you not attempt to preserve food when you're not feeling well. Actually, we don't want you to prepare any kind of food when you're not feeling well. Always clean all kitchen surfaces with hot, soapy water. If you want to take an additional step and sanitize those surfaces, you may do so with 1 quart to 1 teaspoon of chlorine bleach. Spray that on the surface, let it dry, and it will be sanitized. And of course, make sure all of your equipment is clean and ready to go. So what do we do about our produce? Well, again, here I'm asking you, wash your hands. If you have a cut on your fingers or your hands, put a Band-Aid on there, but then also cover it with a plastic or latex glove. We wash all produce simply with clean water. You don't need to buy any commercial produce wash. Just clean water is fine. And we do that just before using it. And the reason we do that is bacteria likes moisture, as we stated in the early slide. And so we don't want to give that bacteria any chance to grow on the surface of that produce. So just before we wash it, just before we process, wash it. Once your produce is cut, always refrigerate within 2 hours. And like I said, wash all of your equipment. And as Erin said, select ripe, unblemished produce and keep it cool until ready to use. So let's talk about canning first. 2 types of canning. Boiling water bath canning, and that's the picture up in the right-hand top of the slide. And the boiling water bath canning method can be used for any food that is high in acid, and that means fruits or foods that have had acid added to them. So tomatoes or figs need to have acid added, and then pickles, salsa, anything that you're using a vinegar mixture for can be boiling water bath. Pressure canning, that's a whole different story, and this is for our low acid foods or our combination foods, and this must be done in a pressure canner. And you'll note that it's a pretty big piece of equipment. There are pressure cookers out there, and in particular there are some of those new electronic pressure cookers. Even if the manufacturer says that you can can food in an electric pressure cooker, we do not recommend it. The USDA has not determined that to be a safe method of preservation. So, pressure canner, boiling water bath canner. What equipment are we going to be using? Well, we're going to be using regular and wide mouth Mason type threaded home canning jars. Not mayonnaise jars, not spaghetti sauce jars, professionally made tempered glass Mason jars. Ball, Kerr, and there are some other brands as well. So they come in different sizes. Always remember that you're going to be using those 2-piece lids that has the ring and then the sealing lid, not a 1-piece lid. Sometimes you are asked by reading the recipe to sterilize jars. Now this is only done if the processing time is less than 10 minutes. So for some of our jams and jellies, this is what we do. And to sterilize jars, we immerse them in boiling water for 10 minutes. Now, some people will ask, can I do that in my dishwasher? And you'll notice that your dishwasher does have a sanitizing rinse. That means it's super-duper clean, but it's not sterilized. Sterilize means you're killing all the germs. So you can only sterilize by immersing it for 10 minutes in boiling water. So once we have those jars ready, how are we going to fill them? Well, it helps if you have a funnel, and it's important to leave headspace according to the recipe. Different measurements of headspace are required for different recipes. And then I say to free the bubbles. And by that, what we need you to do is take a plastic knife, or even they make commercial bubble freers, and kind of rotate it around the jar to let the air escape through the top. Then we're going to wipe the jar rims and to make sure that we can get a nice clean seal when we put that lid on and we process the food. All right, so I mentioned headspace. What's the big deal about headspace? Well, according to the recipe, again, scientifically proven process, the headspace has been determined to be exactly right for that product, for the size of jar. So if we have too little headspace, the food can bubble out during the processing, and it'll get on the top of the seal of that lid, and it could cause a poor sealing. Too much headspace, well, the food at the top is likely to discolor, and the jar might not seal properly because not all of the air has been vented out or pressure brought out through the top. I just leave this slide in because I think it's a little bit funny. We've always heated our lids in a simmering pot. I was brought up to do that. I always thought you should do that. Just a very few years ago, Ball and Kerr let out the secret that they'd been keeping. They'd forgotten to tell people that they'd changed the formula for the gum on those lids, and you no longer have to heat them. So just a little FYI. Once we have the food in the jar, the proper headspace, we're going to put that lid on and then put the ring on the top of the jar just until it's finger tight. Don't crank it down too tightly, because then your lid is going to buckle during the processing and it might not have vented all the air out. So just until it's snug. Processing time, very important. Do not skimp on processing time. Follow the directions exactly. Time differs with each type of jar, and too little processing time can result in spoilage. So this is a side view, kind of an interior view of a boiling water bath canner. And you'll note that there's a rack. This is important because you don't want the jars to be bouncing around or touching the bottom of the kettle, and because that could cause them to break. You want an inch or two of water covering the jars and 1 to 2 inches above the top of the water to allow for the action of the boiling. You don't have to buy a commercial boiling water bath canner. You can just use a great big soup kettle, but just make sure you have a rack for the bottom. Just some general directions for boiling water bath processing. Begin the timing when a full boil is reached, and after processing time is complete, turn off the canner, walk away. After you remove the lid, walk away, wait 5 minutes before removing the jars. And again, just a reminder that the boiling water bath method is for acid foods only. So what about all the other foods we might want to process? Well, then you must use a pressure canner. And that's the picture on the right. Again, it is not the pressure cooker that's on the left. Why do we have to use this for the low acid foods? Well, because of botulism. You might have heard stories about botulism. And in fact, sometimes people will say, well, I thought that didn't happen anymore. Well, it does, because botulism is a naturally occurring bacteria that it lives in our soil. Usually doesn't hurt us until we give it the environment that it really likes. It likes low acid, and it does not require oxygen for it to produce the toxins that can be deadly for us. So if you're wanting to process low acid foods, that's vegetables, meats, combination foods, soups, that sort of thing, you need to use your pressure canner. The canner gauge must be accurate. Your local extension office can test your canner gauge. Food must be properly processed and prepared. You must use a tested recipe. And the thing about botulism is any damage that is done, it's a central nervous system pathogen, not the classic foodborne illness symptoms. This, you can have some muscle symptoms, double vision, and any damage that occurs to your nervous system is permanent, and it can sometimes lead to death. So, very important. So when we're using a pressure canner, there are two basic types. One is the dial gauge, and it's a round gauge with numbers on it. The indicator goes up as the pressure builds, and then there's also the weighted gauge, which has the mechanism to add weights to the top of it, and it will jiggle for a count, and you'll know you've reached the exact right pressure. So follow the directions of your manufacturer of your pressure canner, adhere to the time constraints, and make sure always to follow directions. So when we are canning, there are certain things that we no longer do, or that just aren't a good idea from a food safety standpoint. So please don't use the open kettle method. This was used for years. In fact, I remember making jams and jellies with my grandmother, and we would take a hot jar, put the hot jam in, hot lid. In fact, sometimes we would even invert the jar, turn it back over. It was no longer, no further processing was needed, and we were good to go. Then USDA and the Center for Home Food Preservation has determined that is no longer safe. Everything must be processed, even jams and jellies. Some things that we see occasionally on the internet, processed by way of the microwave or the oven or the slow cooker or the dishwasher or the sun. Nope. Even if a celebrity tells you that that's the way they do it, that is not safe. And again, I can't say enough, we do not use the pressure cooker as a pressure canner. In addition, we do not recommend jars not designed for home canning. As I said, don't use the leftover mayonnaise, leftover spaghetti sauce. We always use the 2-piece, the lid and the ring. There are some 1-piece lids out there on the market, and they are not recommended by USDA. Paraffin wax is a seal instead of a lid. I can remember my grandmother doing this as well. And the cautionary note that we adhere to now is that there could be a very fine amount of air that could get in around the edges of that paraffin, and it could cause mold and spoilage. And you've worked so hard to process this food. Don't jeopardize it by not using a proper seal. Tomatoes and figs must have acid added to them in order to be processed in a boiling water bath. Please don't reduce your sugar in your jams and jellies unless you're using the specific pectin made for that type of process. Sugar is required in jams and jellies because it binds with the water, binds with the liquid in the jam and jelly, and makes it a safer product. And even if your friends say, the salsa that you make is the best in the world, you need to can it and sell it. You can make fresh salsa all day long, however you want. Throw everything in a bowl and chop it up, and I'm sure it tastes wonderful. But if you're going to can it and process it, you must use a tested recipe from a reliable source, that being USDA, any extension office, or the commercial canning companies. All right, where do we want to store our food after we've made these beautiful jars of food? Now, they would look really nice in your window, I'm sure, in the window in the kitchen. That would be beautiful, but what you really want to do to preserve the best quality is to store them in a cool, dry, dark place. The best quality is if they're used within a year. They'll last quite a bit longer. But you certainly wouldn't want to use a jar that you could see rust on the lid or any signs of spoilage. Another question that we often get is, can I use my flat top stove? And the easy answer is to please contact the manufacturer of your smooth top stove before deciding whether or not to use it for canning. A couple of caveats are, that's glass on the top, and if you have a very heavy canner, you could crack the top of your stove. Also, if you'll notice those burners on a flat top stove, they'll get cherry red and then they'll fade away, and cherry red and fade away. The canning process requires constant heat. And so to maintain the temperature that it takes to fulfill the processing, you need constant heat. And most flat top stoves, you can't achieve that. All right, so freezing and drying, pretty easy. It does require a little bit more equipment. Freezing does take up room in your freezer, so something to consider. But freezing reduces the temperature of the food so that microorganisms cannot grow and the enzyme activity is slowed. Drying removes the moisture, so the same thing can be achieved. So when we're freezing, what are the basic steps? Well, we're going to wash and cut our produce, blanch if the directions require, then shock it back, so cool it immediately and drain. And you can put it right then into a freezer bag or freezer container. You can layer it out in one layer on a freezer tray. That works really nice if you're going to portion out smaller amounts rather than using the whole bag. And then to prevent discoloration or oxidation, you're going to want to put some sort of acid on the fruits in particular. So freezing fruits, I included some of these just because it's very simple methods. So you can use a sugar pack where you sprinkle the fruit with sugar, or simply pack the fruit into a container, seal and freeze in a single layer. Pectin, this is one of my favorite ways to freeze fruit, and that's the commercial pectin that you can purchase in the store, and a cup of water, bring it to a boil, add a little more water, and then place your fruit in that, and it prevents the oxidation or the browning, and it also keeps it nice and plump without having to add the sugar or the syrup, and that's what I prefer. So when you're freezing, and if you have a several bags or containers of food you want to freeze, you might want to turn your freezer down a few notches, because the key to quality when you're freezing food is to freeze it quickly. So if you can spread the bags out in different areas of your freezer or containers out, they'll freeze more quickly if that cold air is allowed to circulate around them. Stacking bags or stacking containers immediately into the freezer will slow that freezing process. You might be disappointed with the end result. Your texture is not going to be what you expect. So spread them out. Then, after they've frozen solid, then you can stack them, making sure you always label with the date and what it is. And if you're freezing containers, it's always a good idea to put that label on the side of the container so you can see it when you open the freezer door. So freezing vegetables, same thing, what I just said. Allow a little bit of headspace in your freezer bag or in your container, because the food has a tendency to expand during the freezing process. The other thing I wanted to mention is freezer containers. Buy the ones that are meant for freezing. Buy the baggies that say freezer bags. Buy hard-sided plastic freezer containers. Don't reuse dairy product, sour cream, cottage cheese containers. Those really aren't meant to go into the freezer. Dehydrating food. This is kind of a fun thing to do. We've been doing this in my family for a long time. It makes great snacks. Just a fun thing to do. So we have different methods to dry food. Sun drying, really not practical here in Illinois. You'll notice that the humidity needs to be 60% or below. We have a few days that are like that, but not many. A food dehydrator is an excellent investment. It dries the food quickly, safely, and preserves the flavor. The oven drying, again, not as efficient. You're going to have to keep that oven door open, and it'll take a little bit longer. It helps if you put a fan by the oven door. So the food dehydrator, not a necessary piece of equipment, but it is very nice to have. When you're making jerky, we have a lot of hunters who like to make their own jerky, and that's great. However, the USDA recommends a couple of food safety steps to make sure that jerky is safe. So you can boil it before drying, just boil it right there in the marinade, and then take it out and proceed with your drying. Or after you've dehydrated it, then you can place the strips in the oven for 10 minutes, just to make sure that it's safe. All right, herbs. We had a question prior to this program about how do we preserve our herbs. You know, I'm always really enthusiastic in April and early May, and I go and buy all these herbs, and then they grow, and I don't know what to do with them. So let's freeze them. And you can wrap a few sprigs in freezer paper. Again, buy the freezer paper. That's what it's meant to do. Or in a freezer bag, and expel the air, seal, date, and freeze. Best used within 3 to 6 months. You can also chop fresh herbs and place them in a compartment of an ice cube tray. You can use water, or you can also use broth, vegetable broth or chicken or whatever broth you have. And those make really, really nice little flavorings in a stir fry, or just with regular vegetables, or really any number of things. And you can also freeze chopped herbs on a tray. Here it says that chives freeze best, but I've done it with other herbs. Sage, parsley, I've done it with all of them. You might have a little bit of a discoloration, but they all freeze fairly well. If you'd like to dry herbs, and you can do this fairly easily, you can put a paper bag over them and then hang it in a dry, dark space, and they'll go ahead and dry for you. You can use your dehydrator. You can use the oven. Again, you're going to have to prop the door open. A tray or a screen outdoors. I have some friends who do this, and again, in Illinois, sometimes you're going to get some mold, simply because our air has a tendency to be saturated with moisture. You can also dry in the microwave. However, that's not recommended because you're really cooking it and you're not truly drying. All right, that brings us to the point where we ask you, what else can we tell you? Erin.
So I've been trying to watch all your questions as they've come in, and there's a lot. So
good. That's why we left time.
Yeah, we have some time, so hopefully we'll get to all of your questions.
Okay.
But just so you all know, if we don't get to your question, we are going to send out a follow-up email to this with some frequently asked questions, as well as addressing some of the individual things that you have asked. So if we don't answer your question now, we will. Don't fret. So
yes. Yeah, remember, this is a general overview, and you can find more specifics on our website too. Okay. All right. Fire away.
So what is the water to bleach ratio for the sanitizer?
1 teaspoon of bleach per quart of water.
Okay. I'm going to write that down too.
Okay.
Okay. And then and I apologize if something was answered. It may have been asked and then answered.
Sure, that's okay. It's not going to hurt to repeat ourselves. Yeah.
So I can't write and listen at the same time.
We call that teaching. We call that reinforcing. It's all good.
All right. So can you reuse lids, and specifically on that, lids that may have been used but not processed? So if it was just they used the jar with the lid to put a dried good in, and now they want to use it to process, is that okay? And
okay. So if the lid has been processed, absolutely. It's a one-time deal. You can reuse your rings. If you're using them for a dry storage process, I don't know. I would still, again, this is an investment of your time and your energy. You want to make sure you're going to get that good seal. So let's just use new lids every time.
Okay. Can you use the water from heating to sterilize the jars? Can you reuse that water when you then process those jars?
Yes, and it's a bonus because it's hot. Yeah, very good. Yeah, good question.
Makes it go a lot faster.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you wipe the rim of the jar with anything special, and does it need to have sanitizer on it or anything like that? No,
just a little damp paper towel or a damp washcloth just to get all the food off of it. Yep.
Can you process something for too long?
Yeah, you can. And you can also process things at too high a pressure. And I mean, it's not going to hurt, but you won't be pleased with the way things look. Might have some texture issues. Also, if it's too long or too high a pressure, occasionally you will get food that bubbles out of the top, and then you might have compromised your seal. So you really need to follow those directions completely.
And again, just to reiterate, the recipes that we're recommending that you follow are all available online. And that has stuff for drying, freezing, water bath canning, all of that stuff is in there. And we will send out the link for that after this. So you can find those recipes. And that manual also has some tips along with it of, what types of materials to use in there. So, and then do you store the processed jars with or without rings?
Oh my gosh, excellent question. I usually go over that and I forgot. Thank you for asking it. It is recommended that you store them without the rings on for a couple of reasons. You can reuse the rings, but this allows you to wipe the jars off and make sure they're really clean when you store them. And then also, there is a chance that during storage, that lid could come unsealed, but yet with the ring on it, it might seal itself back. And so, you could have some illness issues or spoilage with that. So, good question.
Is it okay to use well water if the recipe calls for water inside of the jar? Is well water okay to use, or should they use a sterilized water or a bottled water?
Right. That's also a good question. And you can use well water, but sometimes the mineral content of the water, for example, it'll change the color of some fruits. It also might, you might be able to taste some of the minerals in the well water. And so, it's not going to affect the safety, but it might affect the quality.
Okay, and then For the tested recipes, can you change the spice amounts in those?
Yes, that is the only thing you can change. And you can change the ratio. So for example, in a salsa recipe, if it calls for 2 cups of onions and 3 cups of peppers, and you like onions better than peppers, you can do 3 cups of onions, 2 cups of peppers. But you can't say, oh, I've got an extra pepper here, I'm going to throw it in. But you can do that with the spices. You can alter the spices.
So that, and Mary Liz, you can expand on this, but that kind of goes back to that sort of very first slide of content, where acid is a really important factor to making sure that we keep a hostile environment for that bacteria. So that's why I think somebody had also asked why adding lemon juice or an acid to the tomatoes. So that's to make sure your acid level is at that different level.
Yes.
So that's the key thing in sort of the water bath canning recipes, that you need to make sure your acid level is appropriate so you don't get bacteria growth.
Right, exactly.
Okay. I think that was most of the canning specific stuff. Oh, maybe not. So what are signs of or symptoms of spoilage? And I guess this doesn't necessarily have to be for just the canning. It could be anything. So
okay. Well, spoilage, you're going to see mold. You might see a bulging lid. You might see some bubbling in the jar itself. When you go to pick the jar up off the shelf, the lid comes loose. All of those are signs that we do not want to eat them. So the deal with botulism is that you can't taste it or smell it. And so that's the super serious non-acid foods that we worry about, and that's why we process them in the pressure canner. Of course, if anything that you open up smells funky or looks funky, when in doubt, throw it out.
Is a dial gauge or a weighted better for a new person? And I have a personal preference, but I'll let you go ahead.
Well, I'll just tell you that the weighted gauges are always accurate. You never have to have that tested. If you use a dial gauge, we recommend that you bring it to your local extension office and have that gauge tested every year. So again, matter of personal preference. They're an investment. They'll last you your whole lifetime, so get what you want. I do test a fair number of canners every year, quite a few, and so I know a lot of people prefer the dial gauge. I've always used a dial gauge, but that's because that's what my grandmother used. What do you prefer, Erin?
I like the dial gauge because
you can see it.
You can see it. Yeah. I think it's super easy, and I guess getting it tested once a year to me seems worth it. You can see it from further away. You don't have to. I don't know if you're. You
don't have to count the rocking jiggles.
Yeah, and if you're canning, sometimes it ends up, taking a little longer. And if it's like 2 a.m. and you're like, what's happening? I'd rather have it. Hopefully you all can make a plan and that doesn't happen to you. But, sometimes it's just like, I would rather know what number I'm looking for, look over.
Absolutely.
And
yes.
So I think that's easier. So we had a couple other questions still on canning that have come in. So back to the acid, adding acid to foods. So what does that mean? And like what substance can you use to make
sure. You can use lemon juice, vinegar, or a prepared ascorbic acid. And the amounts vary with the size of your jar and what you're using. So for example, it's 2 tablespoons of lemon juice per quart. And it's said that sometimes if you use vinegar, and I think you need a little bit more of it, well, okay, back to the lemon juice. You have to use the commercially prepared, that cheap lemon juice that's in the green bottle that you get at the grocery store. Don't use fresh lemon juice, and the reason being is that this lemon could be more acidic than this lemon, and so they want a constant level of acidity. And with your vinegar, they want a 5% acidity. And some people say that you can taste the vinegar if you use vinegar just with tomatoes. However, the salsa recipe that we have on our website and that is in the Home Food Preservation So Easy to Preserve calls for vinegar, and I don't notice an off taste with it. And the ascorbic acid, you can just buy the powder and then follow the directions in your recipe.
Sorry.
That's
Some
okay.
other questions have come in. Oh, there's a question on regular pectin or NH pectin, so sodium hydroxide, I'm assuming.
What do they mean by NH?
You know, I'm assuming sodium hydroxide. Is that a pectin variant or type additive? I'm not sure.
Oh, NaH. Okay, sodium hydroxide. Oh, I'm not familiar with that. I do know that you can buy liquid pectin or powdered pectin, but follow the recipes. They're not interchangeable. I also make a fair amount of jam. I really like making jam without the commercial pectin. If you use about a quarter to a third, a little underripe fruit, you're going to have more natural pectin. But again, follow a recipe.
And then they followed that up too with apple pectin.
Sure. Yeah. You can buy that commercially. There are some recipes that will tell you to add some chopped apple to your recipe because apples do have a high amount of naturally occurring pectin. Yes.
Okay. And then for when freezing, was it freezing stuff? Sorry, the question is lost, but I think I remember the basis. So when freezing stuff, if you blanch it beforehand, sometimes the vegetables get a little bit mushy. Is there something that you can do to help them be crunchier? And so I think that if I remember correctly, the question specifically was about freezing, but maybe also addressing that with the canning of some stuff.
Okay. So when you're freezing, again, follow the directions for the blanching, and you'll find those directions on our website. And it varies with the different types of vegetables. It's important to blanch and then immediately shock super cold to stop that cooking process. And you'll probably find you have a better result with that. Canning is going to change texture. We know that if you go to the grocery store and you buy a bag of frozen peas and a can of canned peas, if you didn't know it, you wouldn't think those were even the same vegetable. The canning process does soften things. That's just part of the deal.
Yeah, and then the food preservation, and I know this one because I do a lot of pickled peppers, so pickled jalapenos. We go through so many of those through the winter. So that one in the guide that we'll send you the link for, the recommendation is to do a cold water bath overnight before processing. And that is supposed to help with a little bit of crunch.
Ferment, yeah. And with pickles, for years people used alum to firm pickles up. It's no longer recommended to do that. The other thing about pickles and peppers is you want to make sure you're cutting off the blossom end of the vegetable itself because there are some naturally occurring enzymes in there that will soften during process. So cut that off.
Is it okay to use a regular freezer that's part of your refrigerator, or does it need to be a deep freeze?
You can use a regular freezer, but again, don't overcrowd and don't stack things on top of one another. Make sure they're frozen solid before you put them next to one another. I would say turn it down to the lowest setting and don't open the freezer door until they're frozen.
And then the best way to preserve basil. So of those ways to preserve herbs that you showed, which is the best for basil?
Basil's going to darken just about with anything you do. I prefer it frozen in broth. I think that's a little bit better. Dried basil turns really dark. So freeze it in that ice cube tray with a little bit of broth or water.
I think that is most of the questions. I'm
Okay.
sorry, anyone?
Well, we can go through these last few slides, and then if people add a couple more questions, we'll address those at the very end. How's that?
Okay, sounds good.
All right. So here's some resources, and again, as Erin said, you're going to be getting these, so don't try and write them down now. But as I said, U of I Extension has a wonderfully comprehensive website. This is the book that Erin and I were referring to. It's published by the University of Georgia, which is the National Center for Home Food Preservation. It's called So Easy to Preserve. The USDA Guide to Home Canning, you can actually download that, and it Purdue houses the information here, but you can download it for free and then print it off. And again, the National Center is the University of Georgia. And to sum it up, we just want to make sure that everybody's safe. Canning is fun. It's an intergenerational process. It's wonderful, wonderful to take children and show them how to grow food in the garden, preserve that food, and then enjoy it all winter long. It is an amazing, I kind of call it a heritage art, and I am absolutely thrilled that we have this resurgence in interest in food preservation. My one concern, though, is although I like Pinterest, love it, I go through Pinterest quite a bit, unfortunately, unless your source is USDA or Extension, you might not be getting some up-to-date, safe information. So go ahead and use Pinterest for decorating and regular recipes, but if you're going to process and preserve something, make sure you're going to those tested and vetted websites.
So thank you, Mary Liz, and thank you for everyone who joined us tonight. I hope you all have a wonderful week.
All right. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.